Good morning, everyone. I am thrilled to be here and actually proud to say that for almost all of that 10 years, I've been a part of the effort of the USS Constitution to become a leader nationally in family learning, a regional leader, as someone said to me this morning in the bathroom, speaking of issues related to our earlier topic, raising the bar here in New England for family learning. And so it's been quite a ride, and we're going to be hearing about that later this afternoon when Anne talks. But I'm really thrilled to be here to share with you some ideas about family learning, to share this notion, and I want to acknowledge this. I called my talk Family Learning, Laughing and Learning, and there's a asterisk there because actually that term was created by one of the first coordinators of a project here at USS Constitution, and her name's Marilyn Solvay, and her notion was this is what family learning is all about, laughing and learning. And I think that's something that we can think about throughout the day. That engagement is about fun and enjoyment, and that in the midst of doing that, we don't trivialize history or whatever topic we're trying to convey. We actually make it connected to people and connected to their lives. So what I'm going to do briefly this morning is, first of all, sort of try to situate family learning into some trends that are going on sort of internationally, globally in our world. Some of you may have heard this material before, but I think it's always good to remind ourselves that this isn't just about museums. This is about what's going on in the world, what's going on in society. Then I want to talk a little bit about some things we know about family learning, some of the theoretical underpinnings of it, and what it looks like. And then I want to share, some of you perhaps knew that I have now moved to academe. I'm at Oregon State University working in a graduate program and sort of giving back, I hope, to the field that I love so much by helping to facilitate some new generational learning leaders. And I'm going to share findings from two of my students that are focused on family learning so that you get to hear a little bit about the work that they're doing as well. And I'm going to try to do that all within the amount of time that Robert has given me, because otherwise he's going to get some harpoon or some instrument of destruction out and pull me off the stage. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And just from the conversations I've had with people, I know people in this room are trying to do this stuff as well. So we can talk about both questions you might have about family learning, but also about the efforts that you're engaged in trying to make it happen in your institution. So in trying to frame family learning broadly, I think it's really important for us to think about what's going on globally in terms of learning. And it's hard not to sort of pick up something these days and not somewhere learn about the Learning Society. You hear that word a lot. You hear about the Knowledge Society. You learn about the Information Society. These are all terms that actually have been around for quite a while. The Learning Society term actually was first coined by an economist in 1959, actually. And I think this person was a little ahead of, in this case, his time, in terms of framing this concept. But if you think about it, particularly with the changes in technology, the availability and access to the World Wide Web, I mean, we can learn all the time. If, insomniacs used to get up and find a book to read. You can now get up and get online. You can have a question. I've been fascinated going on museum visits with people. I'm not the most technological person, but I go on museum visits with my children, and a question comes up, and of course I'm trying to read the text or trying to find a facilitator, and they're already, they've already gotten on the net and have figured out what the answer is. I mean, the whole way that we are engaging and learning is changing. And something that's really interesting to think about in terms of museums is that learning is actually rapidly becoming the #1 industry in the country, and definitely a major leisure activity. Tourism actually is the largest economy in the world, and the fastest growing parts of the leisure activity world are cultural and ecotourism. And that's because when people are going places, they want to learn something about that place. I mean, you can't take a cruise anymore without, there's always lectures and experiences that you can participate in, field trips that you can go on when you dock somewhere. I was telling someone, in this wonderful part of Oregon. I'm an hour from the coast, an hour from the foothills of the Cascades, 30 minutes from a wonderful vineyard. And what's so fascinating, you go to the vineyard now, and there are classes about winemaking, about the history of wine, about how we grow our wine. Learning is a pervasive part of our world. And just to sort of visualize that, if we create a box that's sort of our lifespan, that looks at hours in the day, that looks at lifespan, which I've got 70 at the end, but of course we're living a lot longer than that. And you look at, a year of time, you can put across a lifetime this small box of K-12. You can put, if someone's fortunate enough, a slice of college. There's a huge part of this life space that actually is not a part of formal education. And a huge part of that, actually, is family life. And so as we think about our role in supporting this learning society, we have an incredible role. We can certainly support K-12. We can certainly do partnerships with universities, but there's a ton of space in this lifespan sort of box that we can fill with family learning. So what is family learning? Some of you know that I guess in 1998, John Falk and I tried to change the language a bit around the kind of learning that our institutions support. And rather than using the term informal learning, which we felt was problematic for a couple of reasons. One is, unfortunately, the term informal has a notion that it isn't as important, that it is easy to trivialize. And so we felt that that was an issue. We also felt that it focused more on where the learning was happening than the nature of the learning that we were trying to support. And so we spent, and we truly did, our organization at the time I was at the Institute for Learning Innovation, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out a term. Whether we found a good one or not, we decided we're going to throw this up the, up the flagpole, and decided to focus on the nature of the learning. Learning where people had a little more choice and control over what they were learning, where they were learning, with whom they were learning, and how they would go about that learning. And in my mind, family learning is a special type of free choice learning. And it's the way that families reinforce their social history and their identity. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. Family members who are engaging in family learning, which frankly they're doing all the time, both when they're visiting us and when they're not, they bring a shared background and knowledge. And they have patterns and ways of interacting with one another. And in fact, we need to be respectful of that, because actually families understand one another. They actually know more about their learning than we do. And we can learn a great deal from watching families and seeing the ways they interact, the learning styles they have. They understand the strengths and weaknesses of one another in the learning process. And families, as they go through their lives, tap into this amazing learning infrastructure. And so certainly part of that infrastructure is schools and universities. But remember that little slice in the lifespan box. But families are increasingly using the internet. The notion, by the way, that somehow the internet is isolating and that people just sit at a computer and don't talk to one another, that happens in some cases. But a lot of times you see groups of people sitting around the computer, playing a game together, someone showing another family member what they've seen. So anyway, we've got this whole host of institutions and organizations that families can tap into for learning. And museums are, fortunately, a big part of that. And there's an opportunity for us to really leverage that in the work that we do. So Robert started talking about this a bit. I mean, why is family learning so important? Why am I so passionate about family learning? Because I am, if you can't tell that already. First of all, we are social creatures, and there's a good deal of evidence that we learn socially. Our brains are constructed to engage in social activity, and very much that's a part of our learning process. And families are the first and foremost learning institution that we belong to. Sociologists really do talk about families as an institution, which is a little bit different than we think of an institution. But this is an institution that has rules and ways of behaving and so forth. It makes good economic sense, to be very crass. The largest audience to most of our institutions are families. We should be figuring out how to meet their needs. Actually, a really interesting movement right now in children's museums is that they actually realized that they needed to be more family-friendly, that they were very children-centric, and that they weren't actually engaging families. The Brooklyn Children's Museum did a study a couple of years ago and discovered that adults were bringing their children to the Children's Museum, but they did it on a day when they thought, boy, I really should do something nice for my kid. If they had a choice, they would go to the American Museum of Natural History, which they could still say was interactive, but was more interesting to them. And so actually, this is really, really important to be thinking about how can we tap into this large audience. Visiting museums as a child seems to correlate more with visiting as a part of a family than as part of a school group. And I'll be honest, this is a huge issue, particularly as we think about families that maybe don't have a cultural history or a family history of using our institutions. And that's a whole other issue that we need to address in the field. But the truth is that currently the research suggests that the more likely you are as an adult visitor of museums, it's more likely that you actually attended with your family. So that's really important. We're creating our visitors of tomorrow. That also makes great crass economic sense. Plus, there's a public value argument in there that's really important. We also know that what happens in the home and what happens in the community is critical to the success of children becoming, successful and happy and productive adults. It's not enough to focus on schooling alone. And so, which is a whole other argument that John Falk and I, just a little aside, wrote an article a month ago that was published in American Scientist. It's called The 95% Solution. Most of the science people learn, they don't learn in school. You can only imagine. We've had quite a bit of response to that article, and they're going to be publishing in the next issue a series of letters. And we were given 250 words to respond. And actually, what was fascinating is, for those of us who are in this biz, is there were a ton of people that objected, that thought we were criticizing schools, which actually we said over and over again. This is not saying that schooling's not important. So there were people on that camp who just were outraged that we would say that schools weren't successful. And then there were a whole bunch of people who were just thrilled that someone finally said this. Some of those people were people in our field. A lot of those people were like amateur scientists who said, I learned a lot of my science collecting information or being a birder or whatever. And there was no one in the middle. So what's really interesting, and that's one reason we chose that provocative title. We wanted to get this argument out there. So anyway, if any of you are interested in more about that, I can talk to you individually. And then the other thing that is really, really important, specifically thinking about our work here and the fact that I know many people here are engaged in history making and trying to engage people in history. I am convinced that actually families are where we tend to learn our notions of what learning is. And it's where we learn to be lifelong learners. It's where we learn that reading is something that's enjoyable and that we can do throughout our life. And it's also where we can learn to love history. And that's where the adult piece comes in really well, because what we have to do, we have to also be able to convince people who had horrible experiences learning history as they were growing up, that this is something fun that they can do with their children, which is what's special about what the USS Constitution Museum has done and what we'll be getting to do this afternoon when we go to our reception. So, I'm a learning researcher, so I have to throw a little theory in here. But this theory relates very much to what we're trying to do. First of all, learning is a sociocultural process. Learning is something that we do and engage in with other people. And actually, interestingly, it's also something that we do in authentic places. And we've forgotten about this because most of our education in schools and universities is very decontextualized. We read something in a book. Maybe if we're lucky, we see a picture. Fortunately, I think some professors, this is happening at Oregon State, they're starting to try to use new media a little bit more in their teaching. But for the most part, a lot of learning that we think of traditionally has been quite abstract. But if you think back, remember that early family unit, learning how to learn, they did it someplace. And there were smells, and there were sights, and there were things, they were picking things up and making sense of the world, the great example that Robert gave. And so we know that that is very much the nature of learning. The other thing that we're learning about learning is that learning is all about identity building. And this is really, really important in the work that we do because some of our visitors, history is a really important part of their identity. They're history buffs. And some of those people in these families, it's the adult who's the history buff, and they are using their child as a ticket. Oh, I'm going to take my kid to this place because this is a really important place to go. And in fact, they really want to go there themselves. And so, in part, what I think we're trying to do in some of our work is make history a more important part of everyone's life. And families use museums to reinforce and enact their identity. And the most important, if I leave you with anything beyond the enjoyable and fun, this is about them. It's not about us, it's not about you. Families are coming to our settings to be families together. And they're interested potentially in history. They may just, give Boston an example, be on a family vacation and they know they need to do the Freedom Trail. But they chose to do the Freedom Trail. And this is going to become, what they're doing on this visit is they're beginning to add the experience of your setting to their family history. And so we need to be figuring out how can we really leverage that? How can we, in the moments that they spend with us, get them engaged enough that they realize, wow, this is a really cool thing. Wow, I can do this back at home. I think we have a historical society back at home. Or, wow, we could do an activity like this back at home. So just a few thoughts there. What does family learning look like? Well, the first thing, and this very much relates to my comment that this is about them and not us, we have to remember that families are the decision makers in our settings, and we can do all we want to try to have them go a certain direction, do a certain thing, but we can't control their thinking. This is free choice learning, and they are going to choose to engage in the things that they feel are appropriate and engaging. And they may not read every label and do every interactive, but they may have a tremendous interest in, maybe they're sailors. And so when they come to the museum and they walk into the exhibit that we'll see this evening at the reception, they get really taken up with the yard, and they want to really look at that and understand and connect what that ship was like to maybe the experience they have as a family sailing. And we need to get over the fact that somehow it's bad that they don't read all the labels or they don't do all of the activities. They have selected to focus on something that is of interest and is valuable to them. And what we need to be trying to do actually is instead have them feel like, oh, I did that this time. I could come back. I never got to that section. I can come back and do it. Because we know one of the issues we face as a field is the notion that, well, we've been there, we've done that. There's no reason to come back. As Robert said, this is about social interaction. It's about talking. It's about collaborating. And going back to that theory of learning being something that someone constructs, it's about constructing their own experience, building that social experience, that social history that will then become a part of the family. I don't know, and I'm not trying to advertise here, but there's a book that John Falk and I wrote called Lessons Without Limit. And the opening of that book is about a family, actually it's our family, going to Civil War sites when our children were little. And actually, we bought at Goodwill little blue jackets and little Union caps. They were definitely, we were on the Union. I'm sorry if there's any Southerners in the room. I grew up in Florida, and I was somewhat of a Southern sympathizer, at least not for what they were fighting about, but I like the South. At any rate, they went around to these sites you know what they wanted to do? I mean, appreciate. Our oldest son was 8, our middle son was 6, and our daughter, whose name is Laura, who is Laura Bartendale. That was her little nickname. What those guys did is they ran around the field pretending that they were shooting Confederates. Once again, they were 8 and 6. They didn't have guns. We didn't give them guns, but they were pretending. They were boys. They wanted to do that. We fought it, but you can't fight genetics. And then they would fall down, and Laura Bartendale would run. And what was wonderful about our war is that she could go over, quickly touch these soldiers, and they were better again. We know that that doesn't really happen. And then they were up, and they could fight another battle. Sometimes when you're a parent, I know there's someone out there, a friend who is a new parent, you wonder if you've really had an impact on your children. Our middle son, and I might cry, so, hang with me here. He wrote his essay to go to college, and he wanted to major in history. Interesting. He majored in Roman history, actually, but his essay was about how much he loved history. And he said he loved history because he remembered going to Civil War battlefields and realizing that these were real people and these were real events. And, he wrote his essay and asked us to read it and edit it. And so there you have it. That's family learning. In all this interaction, in going and playing soldiers and whatever one does, people are making meaning. They're trying to understand what's going on here. And what was really important about those experiences was that they were enjoyable and fun. As Marilyn said so well, it was about laughing and learning. I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done that's looked at the kinds of impacts that we see families getting out of these experiences. And I've divided it up. There are some overall learning impacts, but actually there are also impacts that you can see for children. And really, really important for us to remember, learning impacts for the adults in those family groups as well. And they fall into 4 sort of categories. Changes in perspective and awareness, social development, interests, which are very, very important if you're thinking about a free choice learning setting, and knowledge and skills. And I want to point out, I purposely put knowledge and skills at the bottom of the list because that's where we generally start. And certainly if we're trying to support, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, trying to support K-12 education, that's actually the outcomes that often are really encouraged. But there are other really important outcomes, and that's one thing that we did say in the 95% solution. There are outcomes that we know are very difficult to accomplish in school, and or with all the things schools are trying to accomplish, they just don't have time to do. And so at any rate, we've seen incredible changes in self-confidence of children. And an understanding, some of this work is done, appreciate that my background is science, so a lot of my work is science related, but a feeling of competence around being able to learn about something, that can happen with history as well. I mean, what I've always been fascinated by, and I love history, is that the process skills, the questioning, the inquiring, the trying to figure out what does this mean, the observation and classification skills are very similar from science to history. Children also learn about independence and autonomy. And actually, I think this is something that unfortunately, with the focus on children doing well on high-stakes tests, is getting lost a lot in schooling. And to be a lifelong learner, you need to understand what you're interested in and know how to seek out what you're interested in. And it requires a certain amount of autonomy and independence. So those are really, really important. And then what's also important is this notion of attitudes and perspectives on learning. Sadly, in some of my work with children and youth, they differentiate between what they call school science and the science that they do in a place like a museum or a science center or an after-school program. And, I say sadly, but that's an opportunity, too, for those of us who do that other stuff. And likewise, I would not be surprised if people would feel that, I don't really like history, but, wow, but this is fun. This is interesting. Actually, I had an experience one time. I just have to, hopefully I'm doing all right. Am I doing all right? I'm okay. Okay, I'm doing all right. Sorry, just checking with my timekeeper. Remember the harpoon. I was one time interviewing a young girl. She was about 13, and we were in a museum. It was called the Sci-Tech Museum, and she was in a program where she was building exhibits, and we were talking about science, and for a moment she forgot sort of where she was and stuff, and I said, well, tell me about science and, what do you like about it and stuff, and she said, I hate science. And then all of a sudden, and this was fascinating, she got this horrified look in her face because she realized that I was actually there, somewhat related to this Sci-Tech Museum. And she said, well, I mean, I like this, I just don't like that. And so, once again, that story just conveys that there is this distinction. And so, once again, I think that's that reason why the family is so important in getting someone interested and engaged and understanding that learning can be fun and can be enjoyable. Social development is a critical part of learning, and it is a critical skill that we need to be having in this day and age when we have global issues around sanitation, climate change, all war, all these things. We need to learn how to get along. We need to learn how to talk to one another and communicate. When you talk to the business community about what they're looking for in a worker, they want two things. They want someone who knows how to learn, all that process stuff, because they can't tell you what the job of that person is going to be 10 years from now, let alone maybe even 2 or 3 years from now. And the second thing they want is someone who knows how to communicate, how to collaborate, how to work with others, and we've just forgotten these important skills. And so this is really important. Our settings actually are great places, if we allow social interaction, for people to learn about that whole process. I mentioned how important interests are. It's really sad if you talk to young people, even adults, and you say, well, what are you interested in? What do you do in your free time? Now, some of us don't have a lot of free time, although I do a lot of stuff. I love to read and so forth. Part of what our settings are about is actually helping us explore a bunch of stuff and figure out what are we interested in and how do we fulfill that interest that we have. And so some of what we should be thinking about as we're creating our spaces, and there's a wonderful opportunity in this room of institutions that are pretty close to one another, being able to connect, finding out who are those history buffs, who are those people who are just realizing history's fun and trying to figure out how to create some other places for people to go afterwards. I think one of our jobs is to give people a sense of how they put together and pursue interests. And then there's knowledge and skills. And for a long time, museums have been a little shy about this one. And in fact, it's been imposed upon us that we're great places. We get people excited. We get people, engaged. But it's not really about learning. And that is, I shouldn't curse. I'm being filmed. But that is utter nonsense. People learn a great deal. They learn all sorts of things. And one of the things that they learn, actually, and Tom Krakauer, who is the director of the North Carolina Museum of Life and Science, said it really well. They learn about things they sort of knew about. And there's a wonderful example of a gentleman who was looking at the Charles Lindbergh's plane. And he looked up, and he all of a sudden understood what it meant to fly blind. And he actually said in an open-ended interview, I'd read about that, but I didn't understand it until I actually saw the plane. Interestingly, he didn't touch the plane, he just saw it. And, we're going to talk a lot about hands-on engagement today, but it doesn't always have to be hands-on. It needs to be engaging, and there's different ways to engage people. I'm going to talk quickly about the adult outcomes, because I want to get to the work of my students, which is very exciting. Speaking of family learning, I feel very... actually, we're collaborators, but I also feel a little parental, too. But I think the point is adults learn also. And they learn content. Actually, one of the things that I do a lot of work with poor families who have not had traditional family histories of using institutions like museums or libraries. And what's fascinating is the people who sometimes get the most excited about the learning. I mean, literally pushing their children away so they can do a science activity are the adults who didn't have those kinds of opportunities or, weren't engaged in school because it was boring and just become totally fascinated learners. But one of the things that's really important, and this relates to what I was saying earlier, we need to work on those adults also, is that one of the things that they learn about is they learn about their children in our settings. Actually, it's very, very hard. Those of you who are parents and interacting with the schools, first of all, you maybe hear, well, your kid's doing well, or you certainly hear if they're not doing well. You don't often hear anything about what they're doing, what their strengths, and what their weaknesses are, other than really huge weaknesses. And something that's wonderful about these settings is that actually parents get to see their children learning and engaging. And in some of the work that I've done with poor families, it's just been phenomenal for these parents to say, I didn't realize my child was so curious. I didn't realize my child asked such good questions. In fact, one of the things we've discovered with some of these families, rather than thinking that asking questions is annoying, is actually realizing asking questions is about learning. And so this whole perception and understanding, actually, my kid's not trying to annoy me when they have questions. They're curious, and that's a really good thing. So I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly. You're going to post this anyway, right? Yeah.